participatory Hangout link. If you can't make it into the Hangout, if you could jump onto the IRC and let us know, and maybe we can voice your questions or comments via the IRC link. Adam, here's a slide for you, my friend.
All right. I like the picture. It was initially it was a big one overall, but I kept it as like a snap. Okay, contribution guidelines. A bit late, some might say, but we have decided to create a few guidelines. And I mean, this is nothing nothing major. I mean, there are some the W3C legal stuff that Dom has written those. I just added some kind of general how to make a PR and be a good citizen. I mean, with naming it right. And I mean, the thing that initiated this was actually to document the JSEP reference process a bit more, because now you can actually point to, when you have a JSEP link, you can actually point to a specific section of JSEP. So it, kind of jumping between the specifications is much easier. I think that's a really good improvement. So that's documented in this guide. Other than that, it's just common sense stuff.
So just a question, Adam. Is there anything that PR submitters should be aware of, like to avoid getting bitten by the line wrap thing? Is there anything to do?
Yeah, there's a section about the line wrapping as well that I updated today to reflect the latest automatic checking stuff.
So if we're doing a bunch, before we move on to this, can we put, because it's so hard to review all of these things, particularly refactoring text ones, can we put things that just refactor text but don't really change anything other than just making a huge diff? Can we put those in a separate PR by themselves just so they're easier for everyone to review?
Yeah, you see the last point there, it actually says that, yeah, put it in at least in its own commit. So
right now the line wrapping stuff is not enforced on the WebRTC PC repo. So it would still be a good thing for people to start practicing line wrapping their changes, but I don't think we're quite there yet for that repo. And in general, I think there are still ongoing discussions as to how well we can manage this line wrapping stuff.
Yeah.
While we are on this topic, just a heads up that hopefully in the upcoming few weeks, there will be a new way of integrating WebIDL into the spec, switching from the existing so-called old school mode in WeSpec to the new WebIDL contiguous mode. So obviously I'll let people know when that happens and so on, but I thought I would take advantage of this for a heads up.
Yeah, in particular, in general, if there's things that we need to start doing, it'd be great to have a post to help us not get bitten by Travis.
Travis is very nice when you know it.
Yeah, you see the dog. Obviously, it's very nice. But I mean, this line wrapping. So okay, I wasn't aware of that. We're not enforcing this on this specification because I got one pull request on the get user media one that was bitten, and I think my personal view is that I think doing automatic line wrapping will make the review process harder, because the last tab when you do a pull request, the one that combines all your commits so you can kind of comment in the text and do stuff, that one will contain a lot of like unrelated changes. But yeah, we can try in using this new process for a while and see what happens.
Okay. So are we okay to move on, Cullen?
Oh yeah. My only question was just asking people to not. I mean, put refactoring changes in separate PRs. That would just be my request, because it's just, these are so hard to review as it is. And the line wrapping, as Adam points out, makes them harder to review. I wasn't commenting on that. I was just sort of saying, like, let's keep refactoring things separate from substantial changes things.
Feedback.
Yeah. Cullen, you can go and look at the PR. It's still it's not merged yet, but look at that. The last point, it says like refactoring moving text. I think there's some. It says like put it in at least in a separate commit or in a separate pull request if you have what to tweak that text a bit.
Okay, we'll have a look. Thanks.
Okay, moving on. For discussion today, and I think there's an extra pull request in here that didn't make it into the list that we added late in the day yesterday. So if anybody sees something that might be missing as we're moving along here, please speak up or say something in the IRC chat as you see the scribe moving through the slides, or if you see the slide deck and you see something missing, please let us know. With that being said, does anybody see anything missing now before we move on? Okay, I'll take the site.
I put everything in the list that was in the deck, Eric, so I think everything at least that's in the deck here is in that
so
list.
you refactored the list after I created it. Perfect, thank you. Okay.
So 454 is now included. That's the only thing you mentioned on the list that you added.
Thanks. Okay, so moving on. Cullen, you're first up, and we're going to talk about set params on async.
So at the last interim meeting, or not interim meeting, the last meeting on this, this seemed very simple. We were just going to move it to async. It was really no different than the existing things. There was no big deal, and it wasn't really going to, it was going to be an easy change, was how it sounded when we did this. I started doing this, and then Harold raised some very real issues on this about timing issues that we hadn't discussed. I went back and listened to the recordings. So I think there's a few things we need to talk about here, and Harold might be better addressing than me, but there are the things of, largely we do set parameters by doing the get parameters first, and then changing what we wanted, and then doing set and setting those. So if you had a couple set parameters in flight at the same time, how would they interact? How would their timing, would they be queued? Would they be applied in order? How would their application apply to other things that might be changing in the media stack from other directions, such as the, maybe a rate control engine inside of the browser trying to change some of these parameters around the same time you were getting and trying to set them. That's the premise of, I think, what is the open issue that we need to sort of resolve on this before we know exactly what text to write and what to put in. And Harold, since you raised these issues, let me just pass that to you and say, do you want to say more about this and explain topics or proposals?
Yeah, so what I understood after Sapporo was that it was a desire to have things async because we might not be able to tell within on the same thread whether or not you can successfully apply parameters or not. But when I looked at this from the user's perspective, the user kind of wants to know that if he changes the parameters, then that parameter gets changed. And the JavaScript main loop guarantee is that if you have get change set, then you can make the simplifying assumption that nothing happens in between. But if you have get change set and then the promise resolves, there's no guarantee on what happens in between that you set the parameters and the promise resolves. In particular, if there are two things events that trigger, and both of them cause you to do the get set thing, then it would be really nice to have consistent behavior, and you won't get consistent behavior unless you can describe the behavior, I think. So I was kind of wondering, is this so complicated that to specify that it's simpler to just stay with synchronous, or is it worth it going async?
Well-
And what happens?
The one question, Harold, is Peter made this list of how the promise can fail. Is this the complete list? Because I think everything in this list can be done sync. Or is there stuff that's missing, and if so, what is it?
So there were some discussions about if you are changing the outgoing codec to a codec that needs hardware support and the hardware has gone away, and discovering that the hardware has or been used by someone else, then discovering that the hardware has been used by someone else might be impossible to do. I'm not sure if that's something that's really an important use case, or whether we can get away with just saying, if you want to offer hardware codecs, then hang on to them.
Yeah, the other thing that Peter noticed was that the RID currently isn't read-only, but probably should be, right?
Peter's on the call, so he can
Peter?
answer.
Yes, I think the RID should be read-only. But we should probably get back to the original question about async versus sync.
Well, I mean, I can't help but think that at some point we'll have parameters that you can't immediately vet up front as to whether they're correct or not. And maybe not in this incarnation, but eventually, like, maybe you can change the bit rate or something like that, and there might be maybe it hits some value that's the codec can't satisfy or something.
So could we live with being synchronous now and then adding a promise return later when we actually cross that bridge?
I think that if we think we're going to eventually get there, we should design for it now.
Yeah, that's my thinking.
And my intuitive sense, I can't come up with a good example, but my intuitive sense is, particularly when you're talking about hardware codecs on mobile devices, like, there's no way you're going to need async. So that's my knee-jerk reaction.
I'm not so convinced about that use case. I'm more wondering about Justin's other use case. There's a theoretical one, how likely that is.
So it's so one possibility, which is a mechanism used by other tools I've seen, is that when you do get parameters, you return return a conceptual generation value. So, and when you set the parameters, and the generation value has to be the same. That is, nothing else has changed the parameters. And if something else has changed the parameters since you got them, then set parameters fails always. That would give consistent behavior, guaranteed.
I mean, I see how that would work. That would, I mean, no question about it would work. That would be, that is the most miserable API to program to possible from a user point of view.
Well, for any case where you don't have a race condition, it will simply work.
Yeah,
so you don't have to care about it.
Which is what everyone will do. It's just not ignore it, right?
Yeah, no, but it's there when you call get, and then if you just modify the parameters rather than building it out of thin air, then when you call set, it's just there.
Right. It technically makes building out of thin air impossible.
Yeah, except for maybe the first time, you might make it optional the first time. But we don't have a first time right now.
Right. But it's not clear like how you get in this case where like unless like you're trying to do something very complex, building things out of thin air, that somebody else would have changed stuff out while you were holding on to the thing, and now it's out of sync.
Yeah, now you have.
Theoretically, you could do an SDP offer answer in the middle of get parameters, do SDP offer answer, set parameters.
Yep.
But clearly, that's a situation where you want set parameters to.
Yeah. So basically, if it fails, then you do it again.
Well, what you're proposing there, Harold, I mean, like that would work. And I don't see the thin air problem. I mean, it just like if it's never been set and if you want to create something out of thin air, you call it for the very first time. You call get for the first time, and it returns you something. I don't care what it returns you. It returns everything null, but it gives you a valid generational counter, and then you call set.
So I was thinking, do we have some? Let's say that you set some parameters. Can we have some failures occur at any time anyhow, so we can reuse that same mechanism to report failures with newly set parameters? Let's say we keep it synchronous, and then if something fails, we report it because we already have that mechanism. But I don't know.
No, that would be an event, not a promise.
No.
Sure, but I think that's worth considering as an alternative. Like, the hardware codec can like crap out for other reasons, like in mid-call, or other things could fail in mid-call.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting at.
We talked about this at TPAC and decided not to pursue this because we couldn't come up with, a generic callback that was actionable by the application. Like, if you got this on error thing, like, what would you do?
Well, one thing that I think you guys are trying to build are essentially transaction mechanism, where you start transaction, do a set of updates, and then do commit, and then commit can basically return some sort of a asynchronous result, which tells you whether the whole set of updates which you've done on this transaction object succeeded or not. Because that's most logical what you're trying to implement with all the generations. And it might be cleaner from a user's perspective because they will see a clear place where all the error callbacks are kind of go to.
Right, but that kind of almost argues for like the promise, because that is almost like a batch set, a batch update, that would then allow any errors in the the parameter changes to then be surfaced through the failed promise.
Right.
Exactly. But so the commit will be essentially a promise, or the set so you have some sort of an object where you batch all the updates, and then you have a promise on the commit of that object.
Yeah, that may be the best reason to have async. I guarantee that.
So I didn't quite catch the original rationale for why async was seen as problematic all of a sudden.
Well,
no, it's if we have a mechanism like the transaction mechanism I just mentioned, then async is not problematic. But we have to have some guarantee that behavior can be predictable, seen from the user. So that you guarantee to either succeed or fail.
Otherwise, we have the same kind of issues we had with set local and set remote, where what happens when you call it once and it's pending, and then you call it again, and that got very complex.
We just have it fail if like the promise hasn't resolved yet.
So you only have allowed to have one pending at a time.
Exactly.
Maybe.
I mean,
I don't know.
I guess I sort of like Harold's generational approach better in that I think it might be, I can imagine writing code that didn't involve offer answer at all or whatever, but just caused different parts of your program all were setting different parameters for different reasons, and that it effectively at the same time you might call this more than once in sort of weird, in edge cases.
But they're going to fail. Like some of those are going to fail because they have incorrect generational attribute. A simple semantic of just that if there's an existing promise in flight, and any further calls fail, I think would work just as well.
So
by the
and then we have to answer the question.
Yeah, but by the way, the place where I copied this mechanism from in my head is actually dynamic DNS, which uses exactly this mechanism.
So Justin, an alternative design you're thinking about here is when you call set parameters, it synchronously right then and there decides, or well, if there's already a set parameters promise queued and running or going to run, then it just instantly fails, or ignore the instantly part, it fails. That's the design.
Yeah.
So then what happens if you call get in between when it's pending? You call set, then you call get, and then you wait till it's finished setting. Like what returned when you called get in the middle there?
Probably the last one, either an error or the last one before you call it set. Like the set isn't applied until the promise resolves.
I think that's very clear to me.
The previous one, not the latest one.
So I can promise to make a pull request against Cullen's pull requests to make this a specific proposal.
Just to be clear, though, get is always synchronous, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we're coming up on an hour left here, so we should probably move on. Did we capture all of that in the notes? Yeah, it looks like we have. Thanks, Alex.
All right, so just to be clear, what we're going to go ahead and try and do is return a promise. It resolves when it's done. If you try and set it again while the promise is unresolved, you fail. And if you get parameters while it's unresolved, you get the previous one, not the one that you had just set. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, yeah. And if we thought that was important to be able to call set multiple times without waiting, we could have them stacked the same way that, like, you know, we have the queue for the operations. But, like, yeah, exactly. Until someone makes the case for that, I'm inclined to just say, keep it simple.
I think we can go ahead with that.
Okay, moving on. Back to present.
Just a second, I want to check we're closing on this one, right? I mean, so we had Harold's proposal, and then right now Justin's proposal. We're going forward with Justin's proposal. That's the plan. I mean, I don't care. Either of these are fine. I just want to make sure I understand.
But Harold said he was going to write the pull request for it.
Perfect. Doesn't get better than that.
All right, moving on. Pull request 454, add contributing source voice activity flag. Bernard, off to you.
Okay, so this hopefully should be quick. Basically, there is a proposal to add the ability to access the V flag in addition to the audio level. This is only available in the client mixer header extension, not mixer client. So the use case is basically if you have a peer-to-peer kind of conference, an application could show which peers have voice activity. And so basically it's just a read-only attribute of a Boolean with the V flag. So that's what the pull request is. So we're asking if people think this is a reasonable thing or not.
Could we make it something so people would understand what it is?
Yeah, so the V flag is there in client mixer to indicate if the client believes there is voice activity. And so it's set when, in theory, somebody is generating voice. And so you could, it's only useful for peer-to-peer. So if you have peer-to-peer and this flag is set, you can have some UI or something which shows that they're talking for that particular participant.
Yeah, my comment was
but today we only have the audio level, which kind of gives you a level of what they're speaking.
Yeah, my comment was, do we have to name it a single V, or could we write something?
You could name it VAD, VAD. That would be fine too.
Yeah, voice activity flag is a fine variable name too.
That's what it's called.
Has voice activity or something. But this is bike sharing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's a good point. Is it a voice? And I don't know. I mean, maybe we don't care. Maybe we just pick V because that's what has been used. But in general, it just means there's activity, right?
Well, actually, the spec 6464 says it's an indication of voice activity, but I guess that there's no way for the browser to really determine if it's voice or not, so it would just be activity.
So is this just that the voice level is non-zero?
No.
No.
Audio level is non-zero?
It's that maybe a pitch predictor or something else has thought that there's actually speech rather than noise.
Oh, I guess that was Dan's question. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this at in TPAC, and we said not to do it because it doesn't get sent down from mixers to the client.
Correct.
And this is the case where it's peer-to-peer, and I guess I could see, some value here. It seems like it's a very simple change.
Yeah, it's just this little variable. That's it.
Do you use CSRCs in the peer-to-peer?
What's that?
Do people use CSRCs in a peer-to-peer call?
No. This would just be for the SSRC in peer-to-peer. There should be no CSRCs in that case because it's not mixed.
But I thought this. Sorry, did I miss it on the slide? I thought it was on the contributing source object.
Well, in the new thing, right? It's both SSRCs and CSRCs.
Oh, very unify that. But I guess the real problem though seems though that you're going to have access to the actual bit stream anyway, where the mixer doesn't. So the mixer needs this flag, but the client that's actually going to play this out will have access to the actual audio stream, and so it could do a much more nuanced inspection of what the stream has rather than just this bit.
Yeah, I mean it could shove it through web audio or whatever and see if it's do that, but yeah, the whole point of this thing generally is a pretty simple UI indicator. So that's kind of the scenario. Somebody's just gonna turn on the thing indicating that or not, without having to analyze it in any substantial way.
So if you have a mesh conference and you have multiple participants and you're the hub for that conference, or it's a mesh, you can figure out which of the incoming connections, or actually have this voice bit set.
Right, and just indicate, Justin is speaking now from that information. That's basically the scenario. Yeah, it's just in the case that's simpler than the audio level, right? You're not just trying to show the level. You don't care about that. You're just showing the speech.
Yeah, I almost feel like this is going to lead to a future where someone asks for this bit to be passed on from the mixer to the client in mixer to client audio model, so that this feature works.
Well, no, it's not in that extension, so there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, it's always set to 0, right?
But the mixer to audio, the equivalent of that is the mixer puts the CSRC in the SSRC list, right? Whether the person's in the SSRC list is the mixer equivalent of this.
Right.
So, maybe we should have one common API to get it in both cases, right? But
yeah, in the mixer client case, right, it just ends up, like you said, and it ends up in the CSRC list. So that information is basically there for that particular case. It's just not for the peer-to-peer case.
Right, but in all fairness, somebody can be put into the CSRC list not necessarily because they had speech, just because we wanted to pass through something and play out some background noise.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's a little different. You're right.
I can see some use for this because we've had people already experiment with doing MCUs in a browser running on a server, and this would play into that as well as the general peer-to-peer cases and some of the more advanced peer-to-peer uses.
But then you'd probably want it to trigger an event.
Yeah, no, this is just keeping within the polling model. We're not trying to, change any other aspect of get contributing sources. But, yeah, we don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this. The basic point is to determine is there consensus to do it, or if not, we can just take it to the list or something.
So, Bernard, the one other question I had about it is that bit can be, if the signaling is such that you negotiate that you don't set or use this bit,
right?
What do you return?
It's unset. If you had that equal off, right, then it just isn't set.
Yeah.
So is it ever null, or is it always false or true?
Well, I think in the case where vat equal off, it would be unset.
I see. You mean undefined?
Yeah.
Yes. So it's
Okay. I took that the wrong way. I like that better than it's not that it's a trinary value, right? That I don't get false when you have vat equals off. That's what I don't want to get.
You don't right.
Yeah, unset was confusing in that context. Okay.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with this. Like, it seems like a very simple change. I'm somewhat dubious about its utility, but it seems harmless.
Okay, so is it okay if we put it down in the minutes that people are okay with this? PR?
Yes.
Can we just make sure to use a better name?
Yeah,
exactly.
I have noted the backshedding in the pull request already.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we
And
should
can
probably
remove
move on
it.
because
Yeah,
they're
we
probably
should put emoji.
let's talk about the next.
Mouth open.
Okay, sounds like we have consensus for this, but we just need to work on the naming.
Okay, great.
Okay, moving on. Pull request 462, issue 415, add activate sender method. Peter Thatcher.
Peter.
Yeah, so basically I added it according to how we specified at TPAC. Basically makes the next create offer, create answer, change the direction on the M line. It looks like I didn't quite get the right text for saying that it can trigger on negotiate needed. So Harold, I think, is correct that it should say it will set the flag. So I'll fix that.
So we introduced the flag language not very long ago, so it's not surprising that. Yep.
There's not much more to report other than PR is there.
Yep. Seems good to me.
This is what we decided we were going to do from TPAC?
Yeah. Good.
Is anybody opposed to this? Okay, I think we have consensus to approve this. So let's move on. Let's make sure we just capture that in minutes.
I guess I can make it more clear at the top.
Great. Okay. Slide. Okay, pull request 463, issue 413, issue 363, rollback.
Yeah, so I went to add the some text around what happens to the mid of the transceiver when it's rolled back, and somebody had already made the mid nullable and put in some text about the fact that it can go from nullable to not according to the JSEP rules. So I just made it a little more explicit that in the rollback section that this will happen during a rollback. And I also put in a JSEP ID to point to. There wasn't one there yet. So it's just slightly more explicit from what was already there.
Does anybody have any comments on this?
I mean, the way it was described, it sounded like an editorial change. So
I like this one. I mean, respect doesn't, but that fixable.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Respect has stripped its teeth. Okay, so it sounds like we're good to go on this one as well. Oops, we're good to go on this one as well. So I'll let the minutes reflect that, and we're moving forward. Issue 441, RTCIceTransportPolicy.
Okay. So the issue here was that JSEP had a public value and didn't describe none, and the spec had none as an RTCIceTransportPolicy. So what we did was to substitute public for none, and that raised some concerns about backward compatibility, like existing browsers had none and what would happen there, as well as future extensibility, like if we were going to add additional values. So Harold raised the question of whether having RTCIceTransportPolicy as an enum was such a great idea to begin with, and whether we should either change that or some new thing to be a DOMString instead. So just raising this to allow people to have express any concerns about this change, possible issues, and also to talk about what we ought to do about the transport policies.
I see that Janivar just joined. He is probably the expert on compatibility problems with
well, I'd also like to open the floor to any browser folks who have a concern about this. Like, is this going to break anybody or cause any heartburn? Justin?
Well, I don't think it'll cause us any serious problems. I'm just thinking about whether we want to keep public in JSEP going forward. Now that this overall issue has been sort of handled but directly by the new IP handling document,
right?
That kind of puts it under browser control rather than under application control, which is really what you want.
Mm-hmm.
So, make a long story short, I'm not sure I would be on board with the sort of migration of the enums as specified here in the slide, but moving to a string probably seems like a good idea for the future.
So the only place it's used in the spec is the RTC configuration dictionary. So it's a dictionary member.
Right.
So what's the advantage of having it be a string, just so that we can have future values without updating the spec? I don't understand the value of having it be a string.
So we can return an error if you use a future value that your current browser doesn't support.
Right.
Couldn't you do that anyway? Like
no.
No.
Enums are broken in WebIDL.
Okay. I think it will be a type error.
All right, so maybe that's the answer. Enums are broken in WebIDL.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this should be a string quite clearly, and I think that's a completely, I thought we agreed to do that long ago, to replace all the enums that were possibly extensible with one, and I thought this was on the list, but maybe not. But I get, and I think a totally separate question is Justin's issue, which is like, hey, what do the actual semantic values mean here, and which ones do we need? That's a separate issue, right?
Well, since we added public to the spec, if we don't want to do that, that's probably ought to do something else. But
hi, this is Janivar. I just wanted to clarify the WebIDL problem. If we do want an error, we can use an enum. You'll actually get a type error automatically. Reasons to use a string would be if you did not want older browser to choke on a new setting, if that makes sense. But you have no choice, because it's the WebIDL binding code would fail the dictionary quite early on. If that's what you want, you can use enum. This came up with constraints, but because with constraints we had this, when we use the old terminology, mandatory and optional. And for mandatory, an enum failing was great, but for optional, having it fail was bad. That's why we went to string there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. So it's not so much, I mean, we want an old browser to fail on a new thing it doesn't know about, but we could do that either way, either with a string or with an enum, right?
Right.
So with a string, you have the option to ignore it. I think that's the main reason.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that makes sense here.
Hey, with public, you probably don't want to ignore it, right?
Right. I mean, based on that, I feel like, it probably still makes sense to have an enum, and really what we need to do is just figure out what the values ought to be.
Yeah.
And
I think you're going to still end up in the situation when you start figuring out how to do extensibility into the future. Let's say we have a new type of subtype of relay, red relays and green relays, right? And you want to say, you're going to end up into that preference list sort of thing where you say, I want red relays, but if you don't know what that means, just give me relays. So you're going to put, red relay, comma relay type thing or something like that. I mean, like, anyway, maybe we should have just a sort of separate larger thread on like, hey, how do we add new values into this? How is this extensible? Or say it's not extensible. If it's not extensible, then an enum's fine.
Well, it could be extensible, but like the way it would work would be that it would just fail if you try to call it with green relay, and you would have to fall back and just call it red, just relay instead in an old browser.
Okay.
Maybe that's how we got exactly where we are.
I just don't know how you could do it any other way. I mean, that's. I feel like the chance that someone says green green light, and somehow that silently is accepted, but it doesn't do anything, is even worse.
Yeah. So I think for the minutes, we should probably reflect that PR 432 may need to be rolled back because public may not be appropriate. So that's conclusion number 1. And I guess conclusion number 2 sounds like the enum's okay.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if we want to talk about what the value should be here in this forum.
Probably not, but.
Well, there are 2 things here. It's removing none and adding public. So is everyone okay with removing none? Then we can just talk about whether public should be there or not.
I mean, technically, the only thing this enum does is reflecting what's in JZAP. So currently, JZAP has public.
Yeah, but removing none, right, also has a weird effect on the. You can't just like remove it without putting something there, because that'll also create a problem, right?
No,
none of public
enums
different.
Enums are not quite like that in WebIDL.
Yeah, but I mean, if somebody already has anybody implemented none? Because we're basically saying that if you specify that, you should get an error, right? You remove it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Firefox has implemented none.
Has implemented, okay.
I thought there were strong privacy use cases for none that people wanted. I'm trying to dredge my memories on that, but
I think our thinking on this has evolved over time, and I'd have to go back and think about why we had this at all in the first place. But I think it was because ICE gathering started immediately, and now that ICE gathering starts on set and local description, you know, the application has full control.
Right.
So
not if you're using a queue, it doesn't. Like if you're using the candidate pool, then it starts earlier than that.
Sure, but they're not actually surfaced or used for checking or anything like that. It's not just the gathering; it's the actual communication to the application. I think that was a concern. I mean, maybe now is not the right forum for this, but I think that if somebody wants to keep none, let's hear some rationale for it. The main ones that I think people know we need are relay and all. And it's not quite clear what else actually makes sense here.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess also the minutes should reflect we should have a discussion about none.
I'll file an issue in JSF as well to evaluate section 411 for in parallel.
Okay, great. I think we can move on.
Okay.
And we've also got an action to discuss public as well somewhere. Is that?
Yes.
Maybe next. Okay.
Same action.
Okay, issue 3D9 should have closed RTCPeer Connection State here.
Oh, right. So I added a comment to the discussion, which is basically in ORTC, the ICE transport does have a close method. That's how you stop an ICE transport, and it goes into a closed state. Something like that's not in WebRTC because you don't close an ICE transport directly. You let the peer connection do it. So I think after you close a peer connection, it still makes sense for the ICE transport below to have a closed state. Is that the right question that I'm answering, or did I get it?
I think so. Does anybody have any comment on this? Jan Laura?
Sorry, this was the issue where should we have a state that's closed. This reminded me, maybe this is not the right time, there was another issue about where the peer connection itself closes itself. And trying to think of this issue, it's hard before we've sort of figured out if a peer connection can close itself or not. I mean, if it can close itself, it sounds like having a state so the user can know this would be good. But if the only way to close a peer connection is to have the user close it, they don't need a state, I would guess, to discover that it's closed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's So when you call close on the peer connection, how do you detect that it's closed?
Currently, it's the signaling state that has a closed. But I would actually prefer, if we add this, I would prefer using this one instead of the signaling state closed, because that's one of a kind of a bastard.
Yeah, we probably have to keep that one for backwards compatibility, but I'm happy with setting them all to closed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, okay. So maybe I misunderstood the question, Yanibar. Is the question that the aggregate connection state should include a closed?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it not already?
No, it doesn't. It only has new connecting, connected, disconnected, and failed.
Okay. So basically the thing would be if all of the ICE transports are closed, then the peer connection would be closed. Or the peer connection state, the aggregate state would be closed.
I mean, if close has been called, I would say that it's closed. I think that's the only way to get there.
That sounds reasonable to me.
But how do people feel about updating all the methods that checks the closed state to check this new state instead of checking the signaling state?
Well, are we talking about removing the old one?
So what would the state go to right now? I have a feeling it would go to new. Which sounds weird, but
yes.
So what? I'm still just trying to refresh my memory on what actual values we have right now.
I'm pulling it up.
Well, yeah, I would go to new.
Yeah, it specifically says, or all transports are in the closed state. Actually, yeah, I think this came up when we talked about the aggregate algorithm. It's like, what happens if they're all in the closed state?
Yes, we did discuss this before, and I think Justin had proposed a closed, if I remember correctly, and we, in the end, decided to go with new.
Was this the one where you were like the only one on one side of it, and you gave up, and you're like, fine?
Could be. That's not really usually my style, but I mean, closed makes sense. This rationale
as an
makes sense.
interjection, we're going to lose Alex as a scribe. Can somebody else step up to help out with scribing? Back to issue 389 in a second. Crickets. Can somebody else scribe? Can't really continue unless we have somebody else that can scribe.
See if I can remember how to get on the IRC.
Thanks, Justin.
Ted has offered.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay.
Oops, there. Okay, so what are the conclusions for 389? Can we reflect that in the minutes, and can somebody please repeat what the conclusion is?
Peter?
I think the option is, do we add a closed state and then change the the text that says, or all transports are in the closed state from new down to closed? Or do we leave it how it is? So do we, when you call close and all the transports are in the closed state, are we in the new or the closed? I'm fine either way, so I, leave it up to you guys.
Well, propose what you think is best. I think is the. Okay.
Let's add the closed state.
And does closed state stay in ICE connection state, or does it move?
I think it's already in.
Yeah, it is. But you said like the text here says move to in parentheses.
I think that means more like
copy to.
Copy to, yeah.
Okay.
Surface to.
I mean,
me being overly literal.
Yeah, I misunderstood the question the first time too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should set the signaling state and the RTCI's connection state and the peer connection states all to closed.
Okay, it sounds like we have a consensus? Is anyone opposed to that idea? Okay, moving on. Is it reflected in the minutes? Can someone just confirm? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I'll
Thanks.
make that PR.
Issue 412 frame rate knob for simulcast. Bernard.
Okay, so at TPAC there was consensus for a frame rate knob, and I believe that it was one or two knobs, so one knob was max frame rate and the other knob was scale frame rate down by. Is that accurate? Was there a discussion of yet another knob, or are those just the two knobs we have to discuss? I think it's just two. Okay, so Harold then had a consensus call, which produced only one response, but a bunch of questions. So I think the difference between these two knobs is scale frame rate down by always produces simulcast streams with different frame rates, because they're always in the relationship of the scale down. Whereas max frame rate produces streams always below a maximum frame rate, but it's possible those two frame rates could converge, like if the frame rate produced by get user media is actually below the maximum, both of the multiple maximums. Next slide. So maybe to help us figure out which one of these or both we want, here are two use cases. One use case, which I think has been discussed on the list, is like a screen sharing conference where you're trying to get the screen share to both like a PC and a mobile device, which have different screen sizes and maximum frame rates. You could use scale resolution down by to generate the streams with the different resolutions. And then you use max frame rate to generate streams within the device maximum frame rate. So the PC could, for example, get the full resolution with a max frame rate of 30, and the mobile would get scale resolution down by 2, so you decrease the width and height by 2, and a maximum frame rate of 15. In this particular case, it's possible the frame rates would converge, but overall the simulcasts would never be the same because the resolutions are different. So that's I think one case that's been made for max frame rate. Another one, which might be where the scale frame rate down by might be useful, is just a video conference with a speaker stream and thumbnails, where the single speaker would get the full resolution and the full frame rate, and then the thumbnails, you're both making them smaller and reducing the frame rate because it's, people aren't looking at that very much.
So, I mean, I would ask in that use case why scale was better than max, but I think the point, the use case we're interested in that drives max, I don't care if we have scale or not, but I care deeply about we having max, because the problem we have is where one browser effectively has infinite bandwidth to the bridge. It's not going to be bandwidth limited in any way. And then the other side of the conferencing bridge has very limited bandwidth in some sense, or limited constraints for a mobile device, like a large screen device going to a mobile device, those types of issues. And we need a very crisp way for the central bridge or switching unit to have direct control over telling the browser what to do on the high bandwidth side.
And Cullen, and so you're saying that that's not just something you would control through your max bandwidth or bit rate?
No, you want to actually be able to control the user experience, and so you want to be able to control on a given stream what the frame rate, which is the easiest way to, well, is a very, very direct way to create a given user experience. So this is, everybody thinks about this as a rate control framework type thing. It's not. It's a user experience type thing. I mean, there may be times where we're on if you're doing screen sharing of certain types of applications like this conference today, it doesn't matter if we were all on infinite bandwidth links. We probably wouldn't desire to send the screen share at 60 frames per second. We'd probably desire to send it at, set a max of 5. There's just no point in sending it above 5 frames per second for this type of screen share.
But it wouldn't capture it.
If you're doing screen sharing of animations, it might be different, right?
Right, but that's controlled through the get user media capture rate. Like this only comes into play when we have simulcast and we want to send 2 streams at 2 different frame rates from the same source.
Right.
And like to be honest, I think this is really like a matter of taste in some ways. You know, the key thing that I think that's complicated here is that frame rate can vary for reasons that are not under application control. You know, in other words, lighting. So the question is, like, if you really want to make sure that your frame rate is of the low quality stream is lower than that of the high quality stream, you know, if your frame rate dips.
No, that's not our goal. It's not what we want. What we want is we want a user experience where it's 15 frames per second. And if the input camera had varied from 30 to 25, we could care less. We still want 15 frames per second.
I understand. The point I was trying to make was that, like, others might have a different perspective, and perhaps they want to make sure their simulcast streams are different. But overall,
I totally understand, and that's an argument for both, right?
Well, I think max frame rate is the simplest. You know, I think that this is kind of edge casey stuff. Most people won't set this, and I think that max frame rate's easiest to get your head around. I think there are cases like if your frame rate dips 15, you may not want to send 7.5 or 3.75, so the scale frame rate down by may be an overly crude tool. So of these two, like, I think max frame rate is probably the simplest to specify and implement.
Yeah, so max frame rate is currently in the spec, and I guess Peter asked whether there's consensus to keep it. Frame rate scale down by is not in there right now.
Right. I mean, I was one dissenting against max frame rate. I think that it's probably simplest to just go with max frame rate.
Yeah.
Let's just do it.
Does anyone have anything against that?
Nope. I have more arguments in favor of using max frame rate, but since that seems to be winning.
Since it's winning and it's in the spec, so
that we're going with max frame rate.
how we move on?
Since it's already there. Okay, issue 370, add drop option for RTC degradation preference.
Okay, so probably Eric, we should probably time limit this one, but hopefully we can make a little progress because we want to get onto some other stuff. So basically, as I understand this issue, it's how and when does a simulcast sender stop sending simulcast layers? So a couple of ways this can happen. First of all, the app can, of course, set encodings.active to false if it wants to stop anything on its own. A second way is that the browser could conceivably stop. There is a mandate for congestion control, either circuit breakers or congestion control mechanisms. So the circuit breaker could just fire and stop something. So that is in the ITF specs. There is a question about how the application knows that the circuit breaker is fired, but that's a secondary question. And then the third way is conceivably the SFU can drive it either by signaling to the application to drop it and then the application just sets active to false, or there is this stream pause mechanism, which as far as I know, no browser is planning to implement or anything equivalent. So those are the three ways it can happen. So next slide. So we have two knobs right now. We have degradation preference, which is for the resolution frame rate trade-off, and then we have priority, which is the relative importance of encodings. So here's the enums for those two things. So you can indicate, in degradation whether you want to focus on the frame rate or the resolution or both, and then there's the priority types. Next. So just to review, degradation preference is for an entire RTP sender because it's within RTC RTP parameters. So you set it and it applies to all encodings. But priority is within the encoding parameters, so it indicates the relative importance of a particular encoding. So they're a little bit different indicators. Next. So the question is, are these two things enough to do what we want or not? So as I mentioned, basically the degradation preference discusses the priority of the RTC RTP sender to maintain the resolution or the frame rate or be balanced. all encodings essentially have the same value by default because it's not a per encoding thing. And then priority indicates relative importance. This determines the quas marking potentially of each encoding, so they can be different, like among simulcast streams. There's a question about whether it also guides encoder behavior. So, for example, whether it indicates a preference of encodings to drop if all cannot be sent simultaneously. An example of this would be in simulcast. Say you're sending 3 simulcast streams. You have kind of a base or the lowest one. You mark that as high priority. The medium resolution one, for example, marked as medium, and then the highest resolution marked as low. And your intent there would be to have the best encoding drop first, then the medium encoding, and then the base encoding. I think this is a wee bit tricky because this isn't quite what circuit breaker says, right? I mean, circuit breakers would basically cause something to be turned off, and it doesn't necessarily, I don't think, respect this kind of priority order. But
circuit breakers talks about one transport, basically.
Yeah, I think it's basically on an SSRC basis, right? So if you're sending these things with different SSRCs, say you're sending 3 streams and all hell breaks loose because you're basically trying to send more than the channel can handle. Basically, circuit breakers would tell you potentially kill all of them, right?
I can chime in here, Varun Singh. Yeah, as one of the co-authors of the circuit breaker. So I think it allows you to, like the circuit breaker algorithm allows you to like switch off audio, video, or a specific SSRC before you turn off everything. So it doesn't require you to like, it's not all or nothing, but basically you can do it per SSRCs, and if you start to detect it before, you can turn off things before it says like trigger, like close everything.
Okay.
By the way, that was Varun speaking.
Okay, so the question here is whether these 2 things together, well, first of all, whether the interpretation of priority going to the encoder is enough to allow us to control how simulcast streams are dropped.
I have another question here about the priority. Does it also apply to things across media streams, so audio, video, or how would that work?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, because it's, for example, if you have multiple senders, right, and everything in one sender is, all encodings are marked low and another sender is marked high, then it would effectively tell you the priority of the high sender is higher than the lower one. So yeah, it's not just within a sender. It's kind of applies to all senders as well.
So that's
a bit confusing because I think it would make it really hard for applications to understand what the relative priorities actually mean.
So that's for the IETF transport draft to work out actually, and the way it's currently specified, it's specified as defining the proportion of the available bits allocated to each priority level, so that it's designed not to starve anyone completely, but let some bits through.
Yeah,
so
and that's
doesn't
also
turn things off.
It's also true.
So just to add what Harold's saying here, because I think we sort of have this solved. Actually, we need to understand it. Is that draft says here's how the bits get allocated. Circuit breakers tells you about the total number of bits you're going to be able to put in a congestion context, right? And then the transport draft saying is something about how you allocate those between the layers, and then this other parameter, I forget the name of it, the encoding priority or whatever. If we go back one slide, that one tells the video codec. Well, now that you know how many bits you have, this gives you a hint of how you should use them, of how to degrade, right? The balance thing or whatever. And maybe that should be set per layer instead of set one value across all the layers.
You can set it for each encoding layer currently.
Okay.
I guess the question, Cullen, is does this give the application developer enough control over how things would drop in event of congestion?
Well, possibly not, but the part where it doesn't give them control is the transport draft very directly sort of allocates says like, here's a suggested way to allocate the bits between layers. And if you don't like that allocation, you basically need to use the max bitrate stuff to overload it and recontrol that. I mean, Harold, is that how you view it too? That's the only, you know?
Yeah. So the allocation stuff says how you proportion out the bits. It will be completely logical, by the way, to say that the smallest channel has the highest priority, so that you at least get something through, and then you send the better quality layers at a lower priority because they can be dropped first. So that's actually application dependent on how you use it, which is why it's good that that's a per encoding parameter.
But I think the application needs you're saying that the IETF text would never tell you to drop a layer, essentially. You'll always have some bandwidth.
The IETF text does not say anything about dropping layers.
Okay. Would you consider it to
more
be
controls are needed here? I think it's very hard to separate the case from where you have two layers where you want to send both but apportion bits equally, or two layers where you don't want to send the high resolution layer until you can only send the low resolution layer at adequate QP. And so it seems like, you know, we talked about this, I think, at RTC a little bit, you know, some notion of like minimum bit rate or minimum QP, you know, for a layer is the only way that the application can express that control of saying, don't send this layer unless it can at least hit, you know, this, you know, be apportioned this number of bits. And until then, give all the bits to the lower resolution layer.
Right. So so far we haven't added the min quality thing to WebRTC 1.0. It's just an ORTC.
But I mean, that's what you're getting at here is what's the control, like never mind multiple layers, single layer. Where's the point where you give up and stop sending video, right? WebRTC has no answer to that right now.
Yeah, it's that browser dependent right now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's fine.
Well, certainly, you know, a browser can always decide to stop sending something. That's kind of the congestion control mandate. But the question is whether the app has any control over what it does or not through any of these things.
Right, and I think that we probably want to consider those two scenarios of, oh, I need to send two simulcast layers, you know, one for mobile and one for full res, and then one where I don't want to send the high res thing unless I can adequately, you know, send a decent quality on that high res. And so there's some minimum QP, and until then, give all the bits to the low resolution layer. And like what APIs would we call to do that? I also have general concerns about, you know, overloading the priority. It's going to be doing DSCP marking as well as bit apportionment. Like that seems like that may not be like the right tool to use in this case.
Sounds like we're not going to be able to solve this here today.
Can we at least put down a conclusion as to discuss the min quality parameter from ORTC and its potential role in WebRTC 1.0? Is it?
Well, I think we should discuss the general question of solving the use case, whether that's min QP, min bitrate, some other thing we come up with.
I mean, I don't think drop. I don't think this particular proposal is the right answer.
I agree with that.
Okay, so let's agree that we're not going to be able to move forward with this, and maybe we take it back to the list for discussion. Is there something else you want to add, Mark?
I think what Justin is saying to put down in the minutes is let's not overload priority, right?
So I would also note that we said that we would try to stop adding features to the extent possible, and yeah, the less features we add in 1.0, the faster we can get beyond 1.0, right?
Yeah, valid point. So what's the conclusion for the minutes? Exactly.
Well, my sense is drop is probably not sufficient. We need to go figure out like what else would be right here, but that's probably a post 1.0 item.
Well,
and in 1.0, people can use stats to look at the streams and then use setting max bitrate to turn streams on and off. I mean, that's what people like. We do that to turn off thumbnails in some cases.
Yeah, and you can also, of course, use signaling to turn stuff on and off. Also, I think Justin is saying the browser has the ability on its own to turn stuff on and off.
Yeah, and if anyone's seeing moving thumbnails on this call, there's a bug somewhere. So
Okay,
it's not impossible.
We have 10 minutes left, so we just need to reflect something in the minutes. Either we've got an action item here, or we're dropping it. What's the scoop?
Yep, I like Ted's summary.
Okay, good. Moving on. Issue 442, impossible to know if ICE agent is finished checking. I think this one's for Taylor.
Yeah. So this issue applies to the failed and completed states. They both rely on this concept of finished checking, but the issue is that we could be finished checking on the existing candidate pairs, but at any time you can call add ICE candidate, creating more candidate pairs, and you'll start checking again. And maybe finish checking currently is intended to mean finish checking all existing pairs, and we're okay with it flipping back and forth, but I think that should just be clear in the spec. So moving on to the next slide. I think the Trickle ICE spec already sort of addresses this issue because it has the concept of an end of candidates indication. So one ICE agent would send end of candidates to the other ICE agent, and that way you're only in the failed state if you're done gathering locally and you know that the remote ICE agent is done gathering it as well. But in WebRTC, there's no way to trickle this end of candidates currently. The only way would be using an offer answer with A equals end of candidates. And that would be one option I'll get to later, but I don't think that's very convenient. So before we talk about the various ways that we could trickle end of candidates, I think we need to decide if that's necessary in the first place. So the first question I want to answer is, should failed only occur after local and remote gathering is done? In other words, do we need to know if remote gathering is done? So the advantage of doing this is that failed would be more definitive in that you can only recover from failed when an I restart. The application developers wouldn't have to worry about it potentially flipping from failed to checking if they had a new candidate. And it would match the Trickle ICE definition of failed then. And the only real technical benefit I found is that if you're not doing aggressive nomination, then signaling end of candidates to the ICE agent would allow to speed up the conclusion faster, because say all you have is a working turn connection, but you're waiting for a stun connection. If you get end of candidates and you know that's not going to happen, so you can go ahead and nominate the turn one. Well, in the case of aggressive nomination, that doesn't apply, obviously. But actually, stay on that slide for a while. The reasons for not doing this are that if the application doesn't signal end of candidates, that means they suddenly stop seeing the failed state. So it has some significant backwards compatibility concerns. And I think in the majority of cases, this won't make a difference because Chrome uses aggressive nomination, so there's no technical benefit in that case. And in most cases, gathering is already finished by the time failed is reached. So basically, there's no way for it to flip back to checking in the first place. And if application developers really want to detect this condition, they already could by just saying, am I failed and have I signaled end of candidates? And that would just be something that would be left to the application if it wants to do that.
So you're looking for feedback on these questions before moving on? I think that might be.
Yeah, so basically my recommendation is just to say failed means you're done with local gathering and it can flip back to checking if you had a new candidate.
Let me just ask about a user experience I want to make sure that we can deal with, which is I'm starting a call of some sort, and in the user interface of this thing, I want to be able to clearly differentiate between I'm still trying to get you a connection, but it hasn't worked yet. I'm trying to connect is the message I'm displaying, right? And at some point in time, I want to be able to display, sorry, can't connect to the other person.
And yeah, that would be my final point, that already is fully possible, because if the application wants to signal end of candidates, then it can do that. And the logic could be, I'm only going to pop up this failed message if the peer connection state is failed and I signaled end of candidates on my own, because then I know that things completely failed and you're not going to be able to get a connection.
But I thought that was the issue you were getting at where's the when doing trickle ice, how is the other side required to, how does it send me the end of candidates? So I thought that was the basis of the problem.
Well, how we signal end of candidates is a second question. This first question I want to answer is, do we need to signal that in the first place?
It seems to get the user.
The issue is that it's end of candidates, right? In the event of bringing the interfaces up, there's a question of whether it's ever a final thing. Like, I gave you all the candidates I had at the moment, but if you can't find a connection, I'm going to go bring up my expensive interface and try that.
Yeah, that's a question we'll answer later. There's a possibility that gathering is never done, and so what happens then?
So I actually liked your suggestion that you could get out of failed if you got another interface or something.
Failed has always been considered to be a terminal state. I think that if we're trying to do ICE, and that's a time when you should be bringing up your interfaces and doing things, and the application may use or browser may choose through timeout that it needs to make different decisions. But once you basically say, well, we've tried everything, that's where you end up in failed, and that's terminal.
So you're saying you wouldn't actually signal end of candidates until there was nothing else you could bring up?
Yeah, probably. I can't imagine that you could really say end of candidates and it's like, oh, that really wasn't the end. Unless you're going to do an nice restart.
This is Janover. I don't necessarily see a conflict though between a PeerConnection saying it's I'm failed unless you have another candidate to add to give me, and then it can go back. I mean, I think so. I like the idea of for what it's worth to not add this, because I think it falls under the minimal WebRTC implementation, and that as was pointed out, applications can do this without making a change here.
So, Justin, is there any technical reason why failed needs to be terminal? I understand that's how it is in Trickle Ice, but does it give us any advantage, really?
Well, so the main thing is that failed is just kind of, any failures in ICE are really just timeouts. That we've tried to send connectivity checks for X number of seconds and haven't gotten a response. So we're just saying that, okay, we think that this is not working. The application can see that, and it can say, all right, well, I don't think these things are working. I want to do something else instead. Failed is sort of basically playing things by the letter. All the mandatory timeout periods have elapsed, and we're now giving up.
The problem is if you need a restart to get out of that, and so you could actually bring up another interface, right? Then using timers, you could get stuck in a terminal state when you don't really need to be.
Well, but I was saying that you don't get an terminal state unless it is truly terminal, meaning that you've sent end of candidates, that both sides are done, everything has been tried. There's no point in hanging on any longer.
I mean, you shouldn't send end of candidates if you plan to bring up more interfaces, because you're not end of candidates, right? I mean,
right. No, I buy that completely. It's just then that's different from setting a timer.
But that didn't answer Taylor's question, which is, what is the technical value in having failed be terminal?
Is that for applications that want to have like authoritative understanding of whether something has failed, they can let the browser make that decision and then just use that. Otherwise, they're setting their own timeout.
Well, no, I think what Taylor's saying is, if it already has failed and it already has end of candidates from the other side, it can put those two together if it wants. Is there a real technical reason why the browser has to put those two pieces together for the application?
Like you're forcing the application to pass something into the peer connection so it spits something out that like the application already has all that information.
I'm not sure if we have.
The application doesn't necessarily have end of candidates.
Well,
it can if it's transferring these binary blobs back and forth. It doesn't know what it's doing.
Oh, we have 2 minutes left. I don't think we're going to close on this issue.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. So, what would we like to? We'd like to take this to the list. What would you like to suggest for action items on this particular issue?
I think Peter and Taylor and I can noodle on this a little bit and then take it to the list.
Okay. Out of these remaining questions, is there anything that you guys want to talk about quickly? Or are we just going to skip it for
now? Most of the questions depend on the answer to the first one. So,
okay.
Except for question 3, which was if you've been disconnected and the ICE consent interval has elapsed, meaning you're never going to get out of disconnected, should we define that as failed as well? And the advantage would be that would tell you when an ICE restart is really needed, but I would argue that by the time 30 seconds have passed, you probably should have already done an ICE restart, so I don't see that there are many scenarios where it's useful.
Consent expiration is for a pair, right? So
yes, I'm talking about if it's expired for all of the pairs that you have.
all the pairs, okay.
Why wouldn't you get it back even if it expired? Like if the connection the interface went down and then came back up?
Well, the consent draft says that you can't get it back. Basically, when it's gone, it's gone. You need to restart. Even if it comes back after the expiration, you still can't use it.
I'd forgotten that. I didn't know.
Yeah, it's a nasty. It's in there. It's kind of a nasty little thing.
All right, well, it sounds like we have a reason to talk about this more, so let's take it back to the list, and hopefully we can come up with a good way forward. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I just have a concern that overall in both the ITEP and W3C, we need to focus a little bit more on this thing.
Okay, do you have a way forward in mind, Bernard?
Well, I do. I don't know if people want to do it, but it seems like a good topic for a design meeting or even another interim.
Well, focusing on this specifically.
On this specifically, yes. We could easily spend an hour on it, I think.
Okay. Does anybody on the call today have interest in doing something like that?
I do, because it's...
It would probably make sense to have this be a joint ITF, W3C, or even just ITF, because the main thing is how does Trickleice want to behave together with WebRTC?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is a browser issue in that I don't think browsers can spring up interfaces. I can't think of an API which allows you to bounce up an interface, so there is a browser issue to it too.
No public interface, no.
Okay, so maybe we should be trying to put together a design meeting between the ITF and the W3C stakeholders to try and address this.
Well, let's see what we can come up with here first. Maybe we can, come up with something that on the list we can, everyone can say it looks pretty good.
Okay.
And if not, then maybe we can take it to a design meeting.
Yeah, we're just the same people anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Unless anybody else has any other further comments, we're going to wrap it. Thanks for joining and making this possible, Google, for the Hangouts. Apologize for the technical difficulties early on, guys. We'll try and avoid that in the future. I'd love to hear your feedback in terms of how you think it went, not necessarily on the call, but post-call. Anybody have any closing comments they would like to add? Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. See you online.
Thanks.
See you there.
Bye-bye.